believe we're already on chapter 7.
I'm so excited! I'm so excited!
Leave the story on a little bit of a knife edge. We're not sure what's going to happen next. Is Oliver going to get his mum and dad back? Is he going to find his way to the Hello
Hopefully
Channel?
he's going to rescue Mum and Dad.
Okay. Are we ready for chapter 7?
Yeah.
The sea beneath the dinghy was growing shallower. First, the faces of the wading islands appeared above the waves and then their shoulders. Oliver looked down through the clear water and saw mermaid villages clustering on the silver sand of the sea floor. The islands set their huge stony feet down carefully, picking their way between huts and fish farms. Iris peered down too, trying to spot people she knew. Merfolk were darting in shoals between the island's feet, but Iris was too short-sighted to make out their faces. Ahead, some of the isles had stopped, a crowd of great stony heads rising from the water. Their voices boomed across the sea, exchanging greetings and stories of travels. "Look!" said Oliver. In the midst of the waiting isles stood the Furlstone. There was no mistaking that towering outline with the stolen submarine right on the top. The islands around it were all casting wary, envious looks at its fine wig. Iris flapped the dinghy closer. A fire was blazing among the trees on the Thurlstone's top. Now and then a small cavorting figure was silhouetted against the flames. The sound of drumming echoed across the water. There was no sign of the dangling glass globes. Oliver felt awfully afraid. He remembered what Cliff had said about the Thurlstone's liking for blood. Was that why Stacey de Lacy had captured his parents? Perhaps he was hoping to impress the other rambling isles with human sacrifices. "I have to go and find them," he said. The only answer was a snore from Iris. Tired out by all that tail flapping, she'd fallen asleep draped over the dinghy's stern. Oliver didn't try and wake her. He could see she was far, far too exhausted to help him free his parents. He pulled her into the dinghy and he tucked her into a blanket from a rucksack over her. He looked around for Mr. Culpepper, but the albatross had flown off to talk to some of the gulls which wheeled in white clouds around the other rambling isles. Oliver scrawled a note to Iris on the side of a caramel bar wrapper, then quickly stripped down to his special explorer's pants. He snapped on some goggles and a pair of frogman's flippers, which he found in his rucksack, and he dived into the sea. He struck out quickly towards the Thurlstone. Crowds of merpeople and shoals of silver fish darted beneath him, but they were all far too busy and excited to notice him. The Thurlstone's rocky head towered up into the darkening sky ahead of him. On its black, sandy beach, only the surf moved. But on its top, he could hear the sea monkeys cheering and squealing, pounding on xylophones and sealskin drums. Oliver swam and swam. He was a good swimmer. He needed to be, after all the shark and crocodile and piranha-fested waters that Mr. and Mrs. Cripps had made him swim in. But the Thurlstone did not seem to be getting any nearer. He realised it was moving again, shuffling its way to the front of that crowd of giants. A little cold finger of panic tickled Oliver on the back of his neck. He looked back. He'd already swum a long way. He was shivering slightly, and although the hallowed shallows might only come up to the knees of the rambling isles, Oliver was still far out of his depth. He thought for a moment of shouting for Iris, but he wasn't sure what might happen if the rambling isles or the merpeople heard him and realised that a human being had come to their sacred seas. Just then he noticed that the little cold finger tickling him wasn't panic. It was an actual finger, and it belonged to an actual sea monkey.
What?
He yelped with fright as the creature doggy-paddled round in front of him, grinning madly. It said, blazing eyes with reflected moonbeams. It grabbed Oliver by his wrist and started pulling with it through the water towards the Thurlstone. For a moment, Oliver struggled, fearful of capture. Then he looked again at the monkey's grinning face and changed his mind. It was trying to help him. It said again, and with an answering, another monkey appeared, sliding over a wave top and seizing Oliver by his wrist. They chattered at each other, kicking their powerful legs, hauling him forward through the water in ones and twos. They seemed quite cute, he thought. Perhaps they weren't such bad creatures after all. Perhaps they just wanted to play. A third monkey appeared, then a fourth. The Thurlstone was definitely drawing nearer now. That rowdy party was still going on up above, but from nooks and crevices in the island's shores, more monkeys were jumping into the surf and swimming out to see what their friends had found. Their small hands stroked and prodded Oliver. They added their strength to his, and he surged through the waves, closer and closer to the Thurlstone's beach. And then, all of a sudden, there were too many monkeys. They all wanted to play with Oliver, and the newcomers began to squabble with the ones who'd found him first. Some climbed into Oliver's head, some wrestled right flipper off and clung gleefully to his toes as he kicked and twisted, trying to dislodge them. He started to feel as if he was swimming in wet green fur instead of water. Monkeys were using him as a raft, scrambling up onto his shoulders and crowding onto his head, forcing him under. A scrabbling, squabbling ball of monkeys surrounded him as he sank. And they were so busy taunting and fighting and teasing each other that none of them stopped to wonder if the boy in the midst could actually breathe underwater. Down and down they went while Oliver kicked and punched against the kicking, punching monkeys. He felt his other flipper torn off. Then his goggles. Strong little arms tugged him this way and then that so that he was afraid they'd pull him to pieces if they didn't drown him first.
Ow.
At last, with a wild jerk, he jackknifed free of them and struck out blindly, leaving the monkeys to swirl and tumble behind him, not realising yet that he'd broken out. The Thurlstone's flank was a dim, dark wall in front of him. A deeper darkness showed in it. Oliver swam in, thinking it was cleft that it might hide him from the monkeys as he clawed his way back to the surface. In fact, it was the opening of a narrow cave. Oliver remembered all those cracks and fissures he'd noticed in the Thurlstone's sides when it had first rose from the waves. Hollow, rotten to the core, that's what Clifford said. The passage was too narrow to turn around, so he swam on, heart pounding, eyes bulging, sure he was about to drown. He clawed through the winding, snowy passages until at last he came up, gasping for air. At the centre of a flooded cavern. Through a shaft in the ceiling moonlight, slanted, shining on the rippled water. Drums and monkey chants came down too, but softly as if from high above. Things brushed against Oliver's legs as he trod water in the middle of the cave. Weeds or tentacles. He'd thought of all the squid and octopus that clung to the Thurlstone's eyebrows. Was this where they lived? Panicking a bit, he swam to the side of the cave and pulled himself out onto the stony ledge. Behind him the water slopped and gurgled. He imagined disappointed monsters sinking back into the depths. An opening in the rock wall led to another passage. This one was dry, and moonlight came down. He crept along it. It slowly steeped upwards, round like a stone throat. Weeds and ferns grew from the walls, and he used them as handholds while he climbed. That's the end of chapter 7. Do you think Oliver's going to be okay?
Yes, I think he's going to save Mum and Dad.
I'm not sure.
Monkeys did.
No, because he might
told
say
him to do.
Well, come back tomorrow for chapter